you? Is this it? It's working.
I think we're live here.
You're amazing. Here we go.
Here we go. So let's see. I'm just taking a look at. So far it's just you and me, but
Okay.
we'll give it a few minutes here.
All right.
Wanted to try. How's your day been?
It's been good. A lot of good conversations, including James Doty, who wrote Into the Magic Shop, which was neat.
Uh-huh.
He's at Stanford, and then I spoke to the head of mindfulness at IBM in Poland at 7:30 this morning.
Wow.
And I'll be speaking at their summit next month. And then I spoke to a doctor in the UK who started Mindful Medics, working on burnout, depression, and introducing mindfulness training in Oxford.
Wow.
Busy day. Good
You
conversation.
and you're a cardiologist in all
Yes,
of that as well.
exactly.
Oh
I'm
my
leading a
gosh.
double life. How about you?
It was pretty good. It was an office day, and then midday I implanted a pacemaker. Sometimes we have to combine our office and, I mean, same for you, I'm sure, and procedures. So, yeah, but it was relatively light. Gave me a chance to sort of think about how we wanted to do all this, and
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully we'll get some people joining us. And then did you want to ask kind of where people are chiming in from and call some people out at the beginning too?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So we are live, and I just wanted to see. I think I can wave to you.
Yep, I got
Okay.
you.
All right, there you go. And then,
I'm here. What else can I do? I don't want
oh,
to do that.
oh, nothing. No, you're good.
Oh, we're good.
Um, all right. Looks like we have Mrs. Giesler just joined us.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for joining us. Where are you from? I don't know if you can hear me, Mrs. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Mrs. Gaisel, where are you from? Austin, Texas. Love it. Love it. I imagine it must be very hot down there right now. So we're going to just probably give it a few minutes here and see, that's how you say it, uh, and see, let a few more people join us and we can get started. So, so what is your work week like in terms of like, do you do office certain days and procedures certain days?
It's about 50-50. So half the time is in the office in the clinic. It's a full day
Uh-huh,
clinic, and half the time we're dedicated to the hospital. And that'll start with consultation in the ER, ICU, and floor with rounding.
uh-huh.
And if we're in the hospital, we'll do the procedures as well. So TEEs, cardioversions. And then I have two partners who do the invasive procedures. So they do diagnostic caths, and one of them does pacemakers. We
Okay,
don't have EP in our hospital except for once a week, and he comes in for procedures and consults. And so our patients may go downtown for more complex procedures and ablations.
gotcha. Yeah, it's so interesting just how regional things are in terms of like the service needs and, for the different fields of cardiology, some areas need structural heart, some areas need EP. Um,
Hmm.
so can you see the same comments as I can, Jonathan, on the
Yes, that's what
screen?
I
Okay,
say.
great,
I
great,
can see the comments there.
awesome. Well, maybe while we're waiting, Mrs. Giesel, do you have any questions for us while we're waiting for other people to join us? And we'll probably see people hopping on and off. So,
Yep.
um, what do we got? What do we think about the drug Corlinor? Do, do you want to take that one or you want me to?
I think that would be right up your alley.
Yeah, no, Corlinor, it's a useful drug to slow the heart rate. Initially it was marketed for heart failure, but we use it for dysautonomia in a condition called inappropriate sinus tachycardia and a condition called POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And these are tough diseases to live with and impact every aspect of your life. So Colinor, I mean, definitely has a role. It slows the heart rate down, and so in some cases, you can have side effect issues. But a lot of our patients, they're really young, and so the idea of putting someone on a cardiac drug indefinitely is always a concern. Sometimes I think, I don't know about you, Jonathan, sometimes I think about when you're treating young people for different things, like sometimes you just need to treat for a period of time, maybe with medication, but the goal is to kind of get people back into a lifestyle and a healthy lifestyle so that actually is the treatment largely for their medical issues. And so here's an example of that where you'd use Corlinor and get someone back on their feet and then.
Absolutely. I may even, as we start, say this may be a 6-month trial, and we'll try and get you off of it after we've initiated lifestyle factor.
Right.
And what's the approval right now in the U.S. for Corlinor for POTS?
That's a good question. I can find out and get back to you. I'm not sure the
Oh, yeah.
specifics. I know that we have to jump through a fair number of hoops in many cases to get it.
That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
For patients. Yeah, it's still an issue. And I don't know how much of that is approval related versus how much of it is the sort of just nature of the pharmaceutical industry. It looks like we had someone else join us. Welcome. I'll send you a wave.
Hey there. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. So what do you think, Jonathan? Maybe give it a few more minutes and then we can...
Yeah, maybe 1 more minute, 2 at the most, and then we can get started.
We'll get started. For the person who just joined us, I'm not sure how you pronounce your name. Is it Septarshi? But welcome. And do you have any questions for us before we get started with our little fireside chat? And then this is from Mrs. Giesel. You suffer from inappropriate sinus tachycardia, corrected AFib, been on meds for a while, but in May you had a sinus node ablation. It failed. Treatment now is Corlinor, and it's a little nerve-wracking. Yeah, that's got to be a real challenge. We should definitely talk further. I think maybe if you want to direct message me after the live discussion, definitely be happy to give you at least my perspective. Obviously I'm not giving actual medical advice, but definitely would love to share my experience on that. And you're not alone. A lot of people struggle with that, especially a lot of young people. And you're welcome. Thank you, both of you guys. You're welcome. So yeah, we're happy to do it. So why don't we maybe just get started a little bit with the introductions? Does that sound good, Jonathan?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. So Jonathan, why don't you tell us about yourself?
So I am a cardiologist. I look young, but I've been doing this for 20 years, originally from New York, and now I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, working for Novant Health, which is a multi-state organization. And I take care of every aspect of heart disease that's non-invasive. So a typical day in the office, I'll see someone with chest pain or palpitations or trouble breathing, and I'll do the diagnostic evaluation and figure out what needs to be done to get a good diagnosis and get them treated properly. I also spend about half my time in the hospital, so intensive care unit, emergency room, taking care of patients there. And in the last 3 years, I have a second hat that I wear, which is part of the caregiver resiliency team. So part of what I love to do is to take care of the doctors and the nurses and the physical therapists and the assistants and the pharmacists who are dealing with stress in all of its kinds, to really keep people on their feet and to share with them the latest psychological techniques on how to stay resilient. And now with COVID, there's actually a burnout task force, so I'm working on that as well.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and my name's Asim Desai. I'm a cardiologist in Southern California. I specialize in heart rhythm disorders. Grew up in Chicago, trained in Chicago, and then did my postgrad up in Northern California. Went back to Chicago, and now I'm in Southern California, so kind of all over the country. And like you, I have a strong interest in mindfulness and in burnout prevention, and that's actually how you and I connected over LinkedIn, and I'm so thankful for that. connection. And for me, I think, one of the big reasons why I'm here today with you and with people on the call is just having my own personal stories with some of these challenges that we're going to talk about, and just not wanting other people to go through it, not wanting people to have to go down the same long road, and that maybe would be able to even help one person out there. And so I think that was a good transition that you had mentioned about COVID.
Mm.
What are your thoughts about how COVID has really impacted the mental health, literally, of everyone?
Yeah.
So, but not just people who have severe depression and are at risk for suicide, also just generally everyone's mental health.
Absolutely. In terms of the general population, we know that as human beings, we have some basic needs in order to keep us happy and satisfied. And one of those needs is to feel safe, right? If we don't feel safe, we become stressed. Our body gets activated. And with COVID, there's so much uncertainty. Early days, how is it spread? How is it treated? That people have been revved up in a way that they haven't before. The second reason that there's an increased risk of anxiety and even depression with COVID going on is there's another basic human need, which is to kind of get outside and to do things that they enjoy and activities, going to the movies. We only recognize now how important those were and that we're missing them. And so we're missing out on those activities that bring us pleasure because of the social isolation. And then I would say, lastly, and most importantly, above all, humans are social animals, right? We love to connect with each other. It's why you and I are here together on Instagram Live. We want to connect with a community. And so we have lost the way that humans have connected for thousands of years, essentially. And we're having to rediscover how to connect in new ways. And yet we're missing the warm embrace of a hug of my patients and my friends. We're missing the handshakes. And so all of this is putting us on a state of alarm, a state of stress.
Mm-hmm.
And that's partly why I think it's going on. Now, you and I see it from a different perspective as well as doctors. I'm seeing a rise among doctors and nurses where I work, and also the reports from China and elsewhere are coming in. And that obviously has to do with seeing people get sick, and some of them die on a regular basis, while we're also worried about bringing the virus home to our families. And in addition, there are financial stresses on most people in our economy right now. People are being furloughed and let off. It's no different with a lot of medical practices. So I see it as a combination. How about you, Asim?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Jonathan. Part of my story is I was diagnosed with depression many years ago, and those symptoms of isolation and hopelessness, and just not knowing what the end in sight for a better day, and feeling disconnected. I mean, you think about it, many of us are experiencing that. Whether you have depression or not, in the setting of COVID, we're socially disconnected, physically disconnected. We're social animals, as you said. So many of the symptoms that people experience when they are in severe depression, I think the rest of the world is starting to get a little bit of a flavor for. Obviously, it's not as severe, but I think that it's raised this sort of call to arms of, our mental health system really needs to be revised in a big way, and we need to figure out new ways to help people. In the biggest challenge, I think you mentioned the doctors and the nurses and the frontline workers. I mean, they're having the acute stresses now of having to literally take someone off a ventilator with no one else around, and the family can't even come in, and then the home stresses of, am I bringing it home to my kids? But then also, the PTSD. I mean, this will compound over time. And there's a lot of projections that healthcare workers are really going to be a group that will be dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, that this is a war. This is an infectious disease war that is being fought on a mental and a physical plane. So, yeah. Now, what do you think about, what's your story? What, if you don't mind me
So,
asking, what's your
yeah.
personal story and how you came to this?
So if you asked me this question, Asim, 10 years ago, I would not have shared my story. I wouldn't even be here on Instagram. I'd say, are you crazy? If I tell the world that I have anxiety or if I have depression, I was worried that I would lose my patients. I was worried, and because that was my story. My story was I was a very sensitive kid. I was really empathic. I could feel other people's emotions. I felt my own very strongly. And over time, especially when I went on to medicine, I was kind of taught by the culture that we can't cry, we can't express grief, and yet we're surrounded by people who are living and dying. And so I had anxiety on the one hand, where my mind is really good. It's getting calmer now, but it's really good at imagining worst case scenarios. Oh my gosh, what if this happens? Or what is this pain in my leg? What's it mean? So combining this anxious tendency with really, I would say, a difficulty expressing myself, and that was really my own story, is that I didn't have a language of emotions growing up. I didn't know it was okay to say I was scared or I was lonely. I didn't even know to ask for like company. I need a hug. So that wasn't part of my growing up, and I've had to learn it myself. And so I actually went to therapy when I was a resident in Boston at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. I was around all these people, and everyone, these Harvard hospitals, it seemed like everyone had their you-know-what together. And so I kind of had to pretend on the outside, I know I've got my act together, and yet I was very unhappy. And I was going to work long hours, taking call for 30 to 40 hours. And so fortunately, my best friend at the time asked me or suggested that I get help. And she showed a real concern. She said to me, "Are you okay?" And she didn't just want the quick answer like, "Oh, I'm fine." She could sort of see that something was wrong. And that for me was the beginning of a journey that lasted nearly 20 years, working through really bad anxiety, depression, and even becoming comfortable to say it out loud, right? And Brene Brown, who's wonderful, talks a lot about the way forward through mental illness. Now, we're not necessarily always there. The way forward is to share your story and to shine a light into that darkness. So that's part of my story. I'm happy to share more as well. And I know we have a lot of ground we want to cover too.
Yeah, my heart goes out to that previous version of you that was suffering. And I don't know if that makes sense, but I know that, I think you and I have connected in this COVID era through LinkedIn. The chances that two cardiologists that are centered around compassion and around who have similar stories, I mean, it's just it's incredible. And I want to welcome all the people that are joining us on the call, and please, ask questions along the way and share your story. But Jonathan, I mean, you've raised so many important points in your story. Number one, there's the stigma. I mean, as a physician, it's a huge stigma, any kind of mental health issue, but it's the case with many professions and many occupations. It's not worn on the outside, mental health issues.
Why do you think that is? Why is there such a stigma in our society against having either depression or even having had mental illness?
Yeah, it's the key question. I mean, there's obviously lots of components to that, but just in my mind, you don't look like you have anything physically wrong. You don't have cancer, you haven't lost weight, you're not going through chemo, you haven't had an orthopedic issue come up. And, this kind of like will tell you a little bit in terms of my story that that was one of my greatest challenges is as people learned about what I was struggling with, they still had a hard time when they saw me happy. They had a hard time believing that I was actually having challenges. So then a month later, if I was having a problem, people were sort of like, well, you seemed okay 4 weeks ago. Like, what's the difference now? And so, there's this mindset, of our society of like, pick yourself up with your bootstraps, and sort of there's all these different components to it. But I think a big part of mental illness in general is it's not visible. It's a behavioral presentation. It's what you do. It's what you don't do. It's how you act. It's not seen in the same way as other physical illnesses. And, when you talked about how you just felt like you couldn't express yourself or you couldn't tell anyone, I mean, so for me, I have bipolar depression, and it took a long time to be diagnosed, and it probably was triggered by the death of my dad. He died suddenly when I was in med school, and it just resulted in this relapsing depression, and I didn't quite understand it. And it was so hard to tell anyone.
Mm,
And I remember my biggest concerns as a physician were, the stigma. I mean, especially bipolar depression, because there's all these sort of,
mm,
colloquial stories of different people who had bipolar and acted a certain way.
mm,
And so it was very difficult to share that. But ultimately, I had to just fall really hard. I had to get to the point where I was just so deep that I needed help. And I
mm.
think as physicians, our patients always come first. So thankfully, I think most of us, even those of us who struggle with things like this, um, we know at what point, okay, we can't work. We need to heal, we need to get better, and then we'll go back to work. And I think for the people out, who are joining our call, anyone who's struggling, it's often hard to find that first person to open up to.
Mhm.
But once you do, it really does have a snowballing effect. And it's about just finding one person, and that's your tribe. And so for me, there was a senior physician in my medical group that, he was a mentor, and he was just a nice guy. And
Mhm.
I don't know why, but just one day, I mean, I felt so alone. I just had to share it with him, and it totally changed my whole perspective on things.
Mm. What was the next step after you shared it? You found that one person who cared. What happened after that that began your ability to heal and to get to a point where now you're sharing this information, whereas before you wouldn't have even dreamed about sharing it?
Well, a lot of denial. I mean, when I
Yeah.
got diagnosed, I kept thinking I had, major depression. And when I got diagnosed, I mean, there's so much stigma around these different mental health conditions that we learn about as medical students. And so it took me a long time to finally say, I got to go see a doctor
Mm.
about this. Like you want to try to find every other way to not see a doctor, because seeing a doctor meant meds, and meds meant changing you.
Mm.
The meds change who you are.
Mm.
That's the fear. That's the concern, is that, with any of these conditions. That's why I think a lot of people stop taking their meds. They don't like the way they feel, or they seem like a shadow of themselves.
Mm.
But ultimately, to your question, Jonathan, what got me to a doctor was I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't work, so I had to take time off from work. And
Mhm.
I had a family, and I realized that everyone was being dragged down in this.
Mhm.
And I think that's the one thing that can sometimes help when you're in that deep, dark place, is just for a moment, look around and see what someone else in your life, how they may be perceiving what's going on. And it may just lift you up a little bit. But the challenge is, when you're in the midst of any kind of depression, you
Mm.
have a different pair of glasses on.
Yeah.
You have cognitive distortions. You mentioned it, that sort of this catastrophizing, right? When you sort of imagine all of these things, black and white thinking, discounting the positives,
Mm.
overgeneralizations. Your brain literally is looking at life differently. So when you're talking to someone who's struggling with this, they may not even hear anything you're saying,
Mhm.
and you may be thinking, well, I'm giving all this advice to help them, I mean, to get them to go to a doctor and things like that. Why isn't it working? It's it it, it I
Yeah.
To kind of get back to your question about, what took me to the next step. It was,
Mhm.
I had to fall that hard, but I also wasn't seeing the problem.
Mm.
Does that
What do
make
you
sense?
It absolutely does. I'm wondering, what will it take for our society to be such that people don't hide what's going on inside so much, where we start to recognize that what's happening in our emotions is just as important as happening in our bodies. It seems like our society isn't quite there yet. We're just catching up.
I think that's a great question. I think COVID has leveled the playing field for mental health. I think, like we talked about, earlier in our conversation, the symptoms that you get when you're depressed, people are feeling that. People who have no history of mental health issues are
Mhm.
feeling it because they've lost their jobs, or they're elderly and they have like no contact with anyone. And people are literally dying of broken hearts out there, in the setting of COVID. So people now realize that, oh my gosh, if I'm feeling this way now, how could
Mhm.
someone feel with depression? And if someone has depression now, how are they dealing with COVID?
Mhm.
Because you're not able to see docs as much and things like that. And so, but I think to your point, Jonathan, about like how do we change things? I think it comes from the top down. So I think global leaders who are open and having conversations about this makes it easier for
Mhm.
all of us to have conversations about it. So, whether you take Catherine Zeta-Jones with regards to bipolar, or whether you take, other people that are mental health activists, that's what we need. We need people that are in the spotlight that say, I'm you have me on this pedestal. You think I have it all together, but guess what? I struggle too. And so now you have two cardiologists on a call, on an Instagram live call,
Right.
both who have accomplished a lot. And we're both saying, guess what, guys? We didn't have it all together and we struggled too. And I think hopefully our conversation today is going to help remove a little bit of that stigma.
Even if it's, for me, even if it's just one person who hears this either now or on the replay that says, oh my gosh, these people have had anxiety, depression, and other issues, it's okay for me to talk about it. That could potentially be a life saved, because we know the rates of suicide and depression are rising,
Mm,
particularly in the US. And in fact, the rates, and just stepping back and looking at some statistics,
mhm.
the rates, some in the U.S., suicide is happening every 12 minutes or so,
Oh my
and
gosh.
the rates are going up after the last 2 decades by about 25 to 30%, more in the rural states, and there's also a socioeconomic divide too. So among people who are more impoverished, there's higher rates of suicide. Um, there are other countries where the rates are actually declining. So
Hmm.
Japan and even in Russia, and some of that has to do with societies that are taking this problem of suicide and depression seriously, not pushing it to the sidelines since it's, quote, only in the mind, but some of it has to do with gun laws, some of it has to
Hmm.
do with access to pesticides and other poisons, and these interventions actually work.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
I was going to ask you, Asim, you mentioned that people are having broken hearts now, and you and I have both seen this in our practice. Do you want to say a little bit about that, for people who maybe aren't familiar, that literally the heart can break from stress?
Yeah, I mean, there's a condition, broken heart syndrome, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, where you have acute emotional or physical stress, literally causing congestive heart failure. In many cases, it changes the shape of the heart and its ability to pump, and in many cases, it can recover. But it illustrates, Jonathan, to your point, the
Mhm.
brain-heart connection, the mind-heart connection. That's why, two cardiologists are talking about the topic of suicide. Is
Yeah.
your fight or flight response, your autonomic nervous system, it connects the two organs, it
Mm.
connects everything else. And so, when you talk about issues with regards to depression, and there's internal issues in people, right? Like, if you have a predisposition to depression, you have genetics, et cetera, the nature part. But then there's the nurture part, and it's the things that you mentioned, the things in the environment. Social media. Social media is connects us and disconnects us. It increases the likelihood of depression and other all sorts of things in our teenaging
Mm.
population. So it's how we use these tools and technology. I mean, I think it's a big reason in many ways why
Mm.
we are seeing more and more mental health issues. It has connected us, but it's disconnected us. And the I think the focus on productivity, the focus on just producing and doing more and more and more leaves less and less for you at the end of the day to just sort
Mm.
of refill your tank, you know?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you hit on so many good subjects there. On the issue of devices, I think it's really relevant now because the average teenager is spending 6 to 8 hours a day on the device. And I really think it's important how we're spending that time as well. So what we know is that people who use social media sites tend to have higher rates of anxiety
Mm-hmm.
and depression. And some of that has to do with this comparing that we naturally do. So we see someone else's posts and we say, oh, their life is so much better than mine, or they're more
Mm-hmm.
successful. And it may be once or twice, no big deal, but the average person picks up their phone 120 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, we have the news media, which you used to have to turn on the news at 6 p.m. or 8 p.m. Now you can see it at 3 in the morning in your bed, and we know that bad news sells. And
Mm-hmm.
so the news media is now designed to hijack into our alarm system.
Yep.
So I think you said it well that, for me, depression, suicide, a lot of it has to do with disconnection.
Mm-hmm.
disconnection between us and our core values, disconnection
Mm-hmm.
between individuals, and devices can connect us like they're doing now or disconnect us. Um, I also, since we're two cardiologists, I think people might be interested on how that sadness, fear, anxiety can play out on physical symptoms and
Mm-hmm.
even up to the office. So from my experience, I'd say about 60% of the patients who come to see me, there's some element of their heart condition that relates to emotional stress.
Mm-hmm.
Is that anything like your experience
Oh
with
yeah,
that?
I mean, I deal with rhythm issues, and atrial fib is a really common heart rhythm disorder, and very commonly we'll see an episode triggered by emotional stress. Like nothing else has changed in the person's life except some kind of stressful process. We're seeing so much more during COVID. So yeah, no, I totally agree. I just want to make sure we get to some of our questions. So sorry
Yeah.
to backtrack for a second. It looks like a couple came in. So let's see. We have a question about awareness of prevalence of depression is good, but exploration of why it's happening and also existential issues need to be explored. I love you. You're a philosopher. That's that's a very philosophical question and absolutely true. That there's a lot that goes on with regards to the brain and the medical side of it, and there's also the environmental side of it, and the stressors and the triggers. And then there are, cognitive behavioral therapy is really all about trying to figure out your mind and your thought patterns and everything else. And so I think that we talked a little bit about technologies and things, and we can touch on this later, but there's a lot of great apps out there now that really help you deal with some of these thought pattern issues, or even dealing with if someone is in the throes of depression. There's an app that basically is like a panic button that will notify 5 people in your immediate space, like where you are and what's going on. And so I think what are your thoughts about this sort of existential question of like, why is depression happening, why we're seeing more of it?
So I go back to evolutionary psychology, and I think about it. How are we made? How are we designed as human beings? How are our minds made? And I'm always shocked to remember that we were not designed to be happy. We weren't. If we were designed to be happy, then we would just have sat around in the savannah until eating apples and fruits until
Mm-hmm.
we were eaten by a lion.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, we as humans are designed to protect ourselves and to
Mm-hmm.
detect threats. And
Mm-hmm.
really, some of the challenges we face today are we overperceive threats. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, if someone says something not nice to me on Facebook, you could say, oh, they just said something that was unkind. Well, my ancient brain in the center that's 1 million years old thinks that I'm now going to be kicked out of the social group.
Mm-hmm.
And part of me has that activated. And so there's this existential part of human nature where we are a little bit on edge, I would say. And at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, part of us, we are social animals.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need that connection. So the way I think about it is, depression, anxiety, suicide, a lot of that, some of it's genetic,
Mm-hmm.
and external factors, it has to do with how disconnected are we from
Mm-hmm.
resources. So it could
Mm-hmm.
be food, it could be education, it could be healthcare. There could be social injustice that creates
Mm-hmm.
chronic states of stress. That's how I look at the existential piece of it.
Well, I mean, I'm really glad you touched on the evolutionary component, because you're absolutely right. Our bodies are wired for survival. So our brains, our certain parts of our brains, like our amygdala and our limbic system, our emotional centers, they really can't tell the difference between a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a conflict at work. It has the same impact on your body. This is why an important part of mental health is learning how to connect your body to your mind and learning how to read the signals of your body that tell you what's going on with your mood, what's going on with your level of stress, where are you tightening up, and we can touch on those during
Yeah,
the conversation or later. But the idea of doing body scans and really, when you're in like the throes of a heated argument, or you're severely, like, what are you feeling in your body? Are you feeling tension in your neck? Are you feeling your heartbeat? Because there's data now, something called heart rate variability, which is a measure of your autonomic nervous system, your brain heart connection. there's lots of data now that shows that you can modulate that, and that can actually impact your emotional and physical levels of stress and help quite a bit. And there's different products out there that help to measure that parameter. But it's really, in so many cases, and people don't realize, like the heart actually is the sensory organ that detects threat, oftentimes even before the brain. And there's studies that have shown that someone's shown an emotional trigger stimulating kind of picture, that the electrical signals in the heart actually react first, the evoked potentials, before the brain's evoked potentials or signals react. And so it is, like, to your point, we're not wired for happiness. And maybe that's one of the biggest struggles we have in terms of mental health, is our expectations are off. We expect to have a life of happiness, but really, I don't know about you, but I've come to learn I want a life of sort of authenticity. Like, I want to be able to walk out the door and be at work and be at home and be the same person. Obviously, there's subtle differences in times that you have to, change. But in the end, you really want to be that same person. To me, that's peace.
Yes.
Not happiness, it's peace. How about you?
Absolutely. I want to hit on that. First, if it's okay, I want to read a comment by H. Kolosu saying that technology amplifies the chatter of the mind. And I agree with that. We touched on that. And then Saptarshi had a couple of questions that we can just touch on. One is, what will you caregivers miss when the pandemic is over? And two, what would you have missed out on if the pandemic never happened? That's a very interesting question. When I think about what I miss the same thing as a caregiver as I do as a person, which is my patients getting to sort of hug me and shake hands and be close. That relationship is something that I hold very dear. And as much as I feel like I can help my patients heal from their conditions, in a way, I feel like I get healed as well when I'm with my patients and I get to be my full authentic self. So that was kind of how I would answer that. And then H. Kolosu also says there is a reptilian and cognitive components of the brain, but also blissful states. Exactly. And that's Rao. Thanks for being here, Rao. So Rao touched upon the blissful states of happiness, and part of the treatment for depression is understanding the way the mind works, like you were talking about, so-called cognitive behavioral therapy, and also there's something dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, as well. And then there's a lot of therapies based in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And so these are rooted in this new way of thinking about emotions in the mind, I'd say new in the past 70 years, called positive psychology, which says we're not all broken to be fixed. And there are ways of actually creating moments of joy in our lives. So for me, in my own healing, Asim, from anxiety and from depression, I've been very intentional each day thinking, how can I get a little bit of joy today? Or like if my daughter hugs me, realizing that I shouldn't just take the hug and let it go. I want to look for little moments of joy and really hold on to that. Allowing those chemicals to be released into my body, like you were saying, that heart rate variability we can regulate with our breathing, but we can also regulate that with some of the feel-good hormones. So
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we definitely want to cover during the call is sort of, strategies. And I think we've hit on a lot of the strategies that people can use if they're in the throes of mental health challenges. But maybe we can just break it up into, the personal strategies of someone who has depression and who is maybe even contemplating suicide. And again, we're not dispensing medical advice. We definitely encourage people to call 911 if there's an emergency, call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. But if you just think about it from the standpoint of, a toolbox, it's important to have a toolbox that you can go to when you're struggling. So things that will immediately pick you up, and whether that's hugging your daughter, whether that's hugging your dog, whether that's going out for a run. So to have that, to know what that is, to write it in your phone so you have it every day so you don't forget it. And then you want to have your daily practices, the things you do every day to keep your gas tank full, to keep your mood tank full. So to me, like that's sort of one side of the strategies. And then what are the strategies for the people who care for someone who has mental health challenges? What do you tell families? What do you tell friends? And, you know, I'd love to hear your perspective. My just immediate thoughts on it, having been someone struggling with mental health issues and seeing the impact it had on my family, is one of the best things that someone could do is not try to fix you. You know, when you are trying to figure out what to do when someone's depressed, it's similar to when someone loses a loved one, you know, that grief process. The best thing you can do is just be with them. Look at them in the eye, sit with them. It's uncomfortable sometimes, there's no talking, but you know, people will seek out your advice if they really want your advice. But a common way to shut someone down is to be expressing a lot of different pieces of advice where you have really no idea what that person's going through. So we're talking about empathy, right? We're talking about stepping into that other person's shoes, and the compassion part of empathy, the verb of empathy, what you do with the empathy is as a family member, what have you, is to just be with that person, listen, be quick to listen, slow to speak. What are your thoughts about these two different sides of the strategy coin?
I think those are great suggestions. And I'm always interested in what makes it hard to do those things. So, there are really 5 steps that we would recommend, and this is from the CDC, that anyone who is with someone that needs help do. And the first thing is to ask, simply to ask very directly, not to beat around the bush, but to say, if someone is showing the warning signs, let's say, talking about hurting themselves, talking about feeling down all the time, having no joy in their life, showing addictive behaviors, you ask, you say, are you feeling depressed? Are you thinking about hurting yourself or committing suicide? So that's really the first thing. And then what you were talking about, which I think is really critical, is listening. And so often we rush to give advice, like you say, and we rush to jump in. And I think some of that is because people are uncomfortable. People are uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about mental health. I don't want to hear about it, our family or on our society. And so that active listening, Asim, like you said, means when you go in, you ask someone, are you struggling? And you commit to not butting in, just be there. And then the third step is also making sure that someone is safe. So it really matters if someone has a gun in their home or if they have access to some way of hurting themselves and trying to remove that. And then the other steps are calling for help if it's needed, or encouraging a friend, saying, do you have a chaplain? Do you have a close friend? Do you have somebody? Or do you want to call this hotline? And then the most important step, I would say, is staying with someone after they've reached out to you. So your job isn't done once someone has asked for help. You may want to check in the next day or even a week later. Hey, I remember you were feeling down. What's your plan? Another important part, which I love that you hit on, is having a plan for yourself. And there's actually research that says people who are depressed and have been suicidal, who make a plan about what to do if they feel that way again, have a lower risk in the future. So you write down, here's how I'm going to recognize when I'm about to either kill myself, commit suicide, or I'm thinking about it. Here are the things I'm going to do. Here's who I'm going to call. Here's someone who cares about me. And here are the hotline numbers. So an action plan is very important as well.
No, I think those are great points, Jonathan. I mean, the action plan is almost like a life hack in the sense that, you know, you want to have something sort of built in that when you're feeling really down, or when someone's feeling really down, you know, you get into that cognitive distortion, that fight or flight. You see the world very differently through very different glasses, and you may not think about all the things that help you get out of it. So to have those things written down somewhere that you can go to when you're feeling down, to just say, oh, that's right, I do feel good if I just go outside. Something as simple as that. Can you see this? Is this showing up on your screen, this little picture? Yeah, so this is my poor man's way of showing a variety of different mental health apps. So forgive me, I'm a cardiologist. I don't do this for a living. But that's what we can always say, right? Yes. So I wanted to draw attention to, I don't think it's going to project that great, but in the upper left-hand corner, it's cut off, but there's an app called Not Okay. And it's just a good example. It was created by a teenager, and it's for teenagers, but I think anyone can really use it. You list the 5 emergency contacts, and it's like there's a panic button that you hit that immediately sends a message out that you're not okay, and immediately gives your GPS location. And it's just something I think for anyone who either has attempted or is prone to it, it's a good thing to have. And if you just kind of look around this template, there's talk therapy apps, there's mood kit apps, there's breathe apps, there's a meditation apps. So that is something in terms of the strategies part that that I have to figure out how to get this thing off the screen. Well, we may be stuck with this. Is it still on your screen?
Yes, it's still there.
Oh boy. Okay, let's see. Oh, I think I shrunk it, right?
Yeah,
Can
it's shrunk now. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think that collection of apps is great. And then for people who are listening and thinking, well, what do I do if I need help? It's very helpful, like we were saying again, think about what resources you have inside of you already, and think about what resources are outside of you. So who can you call for help? And so the resources inside have to do with working with challenging thoughts, right? And working with challenging emotions. That's kind of it. And so there are literally skills that we can develop that help us deal with the depressed thoughts and the anxious thoughts, learn to observe them. And there are skills to work with the anxious and depressed feelings in the body. And those involve more body movement. So that could be exercise, getting outdoors, even listening to music. That can shift the body state, whereas the mind is more into that cognitive behavioral mindfulness techniques. So that's how I think about that. And then, well, what do I do in the outside world? That's where we can get into friends and hotlines and really asking one other person for help.
Yeah, I think, having the internal skill set and tools, the external with your social connections, this whole idea of the mind body, I think, so many of us get caught up in these narratives, even if you don't struggle with depression, just one negative thing happens and you end up creating this whole story that, goes on for almost like 2 hours of like, well, this happened at work, so then I'm going to get fired, and this is going to happen, and that's going to happen. And bringing your body into it snaps you out of your head. Getting up and moving around, taking deep breaths, it snaps you away from those talk tracks, and it gives you a reset. That's why doing 3 deep breaths helps in many cases when you're feeling anxious, because yes, you're activating the parasympathetic nervous system and there's a biological component, but there's also this component of, well, if I'm focused on my breathing, I'm not focused on that obsessive thought that I had. Yeah. And so, I think that's really where, and when we're talking about strategies, there's a lot of different ones out there. Many people know, but the 5 senses are one of the easiest things to remember. We have 5 senses. And if you're feeling in the throes of something anxious or depressed, you just 5 things that I can see, 4 things that I can hear, 3 things that I can touch, 2 things, et cetera, et cetera. And that process has been shown to really help lower your anxiety level. What are your thoughts, Jonathan, on that?
Yeah, it's something that they didn't teach us about in medical school, was working with the body, and the body as being part of our mind, literally. So tuning into the sensations in the body. There's a research now that says our brain often misinterprets senses in our body. So you were saying before that the heart can detect fear before the mind does. Well, a lot of times I may be in a situation, let's say giving a talk or being in a stressful situation, I can feel my heart beating faster. Now that's not an issue by itself, but what happens is my mind feels it and interprets it the wrong way and says, I must be in danger now. Right. And so that's where our thoughts are so important. Whereas if I can then recognize that, oh, just because I thought it, I don't have to believe that. Right. I can choose to interpret it a different way. Oh, it just means that my body's getting ready for something that's important to me. That's all it means. So that's it's called reappraisal or cognitive reframing. It's such a powerful tool here. I thought something came up in my mind, Asim, when you talked about that app, Not Okay. Yeah. And I wanted to make this point, and I wish I had heard this when I was younger, and I wish when I was struggling 10 years ago, that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not be okay. We often expect people, when we say, how you doing? It's almost like we want them to say everything's fine. And because we're so rushed in our day, we're not prepared to listen to the answer. So I want to get that message out there. If you're feeling bad, if you're feeling down, there's nothing wrong with you. It doesn't mean you're broken. It's part of being a human to have ups and downs. And sometimes just acknowledging that and not beating yourself up by giving yourself the same love that you would give a pet or someone you love, giving
Hmm.
yourself compassion, it's called self-compassion, for me was a big part of my own healing. Through when I started to get into a mood where I know it could go on for a day or even a week or two, where I'm going to feel down, I allow it to happen. I say, I'm not going to force this. And then I give myself some kindness in that moment. I say, I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm just going to let it be. And sometimes that's all that's needed for me.
No, I think the self-compassion and, loving kindness meditations, for example, really kind of teach you that. And what people on the call, may or may not know is there's a ton of science behind this. There's a lot of science that shows improvement in mood and in relationships and all these other things when you are treating yourself like your friend and you do that sort of self-compassion component, So I think about like just in terms of how much do we judge ourselves? Like we would never treat a friend the way sometimes we treat ourselves in terms of how those judgments occur. And, it's really about a practice. Like when you start to do a few minutes a day of the work that you're talking about, mindfulness, etc., then it builds, it creates this brain muscle so
Mm,
that then when you're in the throes of something, you have a little bit more reserve than you didn't have before,
mm,
and I noticed it especially, when I was in med school and my dad died suddenly and that threw me into depression. you know Over the years I developed these different tools and got treatment, and about 2 years ago my mom died suddenly.
mm,
And obviously I was older, so I had a additional amount of wisdom, but I handle it in a very different way. And I think a lot of it had to do with trying to employ these tools, create these social networks and
mm,
the mindfulness part and the exercise part. So it's important for people to have the two sets of strategies: what to
mm.
do in the throes of the moment,
Yeah.
and what you can do every day to build that resilience.
Can I ask you, what would happen if we taught our children these tools at home or in school? In terms, I have my own theory that this should be, as much a part of our children's education as learning math or learning science. These social and emotional learning skills, how to cope with distress, especially with rising rates. And then for us in medical school, if I had gotten one lecture, I spent 3 months learning neuroanatomy. If I got 1 hour on what do you do when you inevitably will feel anxious and maybe depressed, it may have gone a long way. So I think you and I and people on this call can do a lot to get the message out there that it's time to start educating people who maybe are younger than us. What are the tools that are available?
No, that's absolutely, I think that's a great point. I think you and I have talked about this book, Permission to Feel, and that's really what it's all about. Is the author of that book, I think he's at Yale. He has formed this I don't, not organization, but there's a practice that they bring into schools to teach kids emotional vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's presented in a variety of different ways, and it's happening. Teaching kids mindfulness, teaching kids yoga, teaching kids emotional vocabulary. I think it's critical. And the
Mm,
question is, how do we get our current adults, especially people who may have a hard time believing the validity of it? I know that when you have done talks before and you've shared this with me, and you're looking at some physicians out there in the audience, and you're knowing that they're not buying into what you're saying, and I sort of think about, there are the people on this call who are on this call for a reason, because they're interested. Maybe they're struggling. Maybe they're interested in learning more. And then there are the people who don't realize they have a problem yet. And then there are the people who are just, closed off and maybe have never had a problem and never will. And
mm,
so what are your thoughts about, like, how do we get this message out that we're talking about today, about you're not alone, and
mm.
there's help out there,
Yeah.
and just like you said, ask one person for
Yeah.
help.
Well, the first thing is I'll say it takes courage, but the way to get the message out there is, like you said at the beginning, having leaders, people in positions of either fame or authority, or people who maybe look like they have it all together. This could be a public figure, a government agent, and it could be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company with thousands of employees to say, I have had this myself. And I think the power of you sharing your story, the power of me sharing my story, sometimes that's all it takes.
Yeah.
Because I guarantee this didn't happen 10 years ago. And imagine how normal, much more normal this conversation will be maybe 10 years from now, post-COVID, when you, as you said, we're dealing with these rising rates where the whole population may be struggling with anxiety, depression, PTSD, or a higher proportion. So I think honesty. I think social media is very helpful for this. I think this month, Suicide Awareness Month, this is useful. And so those are my thoughts.
And we ask everyone on the call, please, we're gonna record. This is recorded. We'll post it on IGTV. We'll post it on a variety of different social media channels. Please follow us both and get the word out. Share this call and let us know what was helpful, what you want to hear more about. I think that there's so much more that we can accomplish we need to normalize in society mental health. We need to make it a part of everyday conversation. And I think that the question, rather than how are you, is tell me how you're feeling. There's a very distinct difference between the two. How are you? You could say, I'm fine. How are you doing? Okay, how are you? Or you can say, tell me how you're feeling, because that tells the person, you're actually interested in how they're feeling, and you want to know specifics. And there are these subtle little things that we can do for each other. And we titled this talk, Stories and Strategies. I think our stories that each of us have, no matter what we've struggled with, create strategies of how we've had to deal with it. And if we exchange those stories, we learn each other's strategies. So the two are really interconnected. I mean, what do you think?
Absolutely. This is really a never-ending process. The process of daily trying to nurture my mind, to keep my mind healthy, and to keep it out of survival mode, which is where it likes to go. And part of that is just talking to you about this and talking to the community that's joined us, and really spreading the word. And the other thing I think, Asim, for us, I think it's incumbent on healthcare providers to get comfortable with this. I'll tell you that when my organization had said, well, we all have to be screening for depression, I'll be honest with you, I had resistance. I didn't want to have to ask every patient who came in with pain in their chest if they were feeling depressed. And yet now I feel very differently, because I know that depression not only may lead to suicide if it's not checked, but I know that screening works. We can catch another 1 million or 2 million people each year and potentially get them help and prevent suicide, which it's about 50,000 people in the U.S. are killing themselves each year, over 1 million attempts. And the good news, if there's any good news, is that there are interventions that work. There are ways of reducing the risk of sometimes this preventable tragedy. And it starts by asking, it starts by facing this stigma and trying to smash the stigma and say, it's okay to have struggles with mental health. It's okay. You're not alone.
Absolutely true. I mean, you have two cardiologists that have struggled and have stories and have come through it and continue to learn. And Instagram Live is telling me we have 50 seconds left in our conversation here. So are there any parting words or messages that you would like our listeners to hear?
I'd like everyone to really focus on taking care of their emotional hearts. We always focus on, well, what should I eat to prevent a heart attack? I'd like to think, well, what should my diet, who should I surround myself with that can help support me emotionally? And what news can I make